Christmas morning, 2025, Sandringham, Norfolk. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie walk down the narrow lane toward St Mary Magdalene Church, flanked on either side by members of the royal family. King Charles, Queen Camilla, the Prince and Princess of Wales, all present, all visible. The sisters are dressed carefully, smiling carefully, existing carefully in the frame. Their father, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, whose title removal process had been initiated 2 months earlier, isn't there. Their mother, Sarah Ferguson, isn't there either. The daughters walk, the parents stay home, and the picture suggested a clear message. Everyone acted surprised when the York sisters were eventually pushed to the margins, but the signs were there for years. Beatrice and Eugenie's exclusion from the monarchy's active future didn't happen because of a single catastrophic event. It looked more like the end of a long institutional process, a slow, visible drift toward the margins, one withdrawn invitation and one carefully worded briefing at a time, over well more than a decade. To understand why Beatrice and Eugenie were always vulnerable, you have to understand the strange category they occupied inside the monarchy. Both women are princesses. Both hold the style Her Royal Highness. They got these titles automatically at birth, under King George V's Letters Patent of 1917, which grants HRH and a princely or princess title to grandchildren of the sovereign born through the male line. Their father is the son of Queen Elizabeth II. The paperwork was never in question. But a title and a job are two different things inside the British monarchy. Beatrice, now 37, and Eugenie, 35, were never made full-time working royals. They don't carry out official engagements on behalf of the king. They were expected, from relatively early in their adult lives, to earn their own livings. Beatrice built a career outside the working royal system. Eugenie did the same, including work in the art world. Both built real careers, and both existed in a liminal space that was, structurally, a trap. They were princesses by blood, but optional by design. Too royal to be private, not royal enough to be protected. Their cousin Prince William was a full-time working royal with a household, staff, and the institutional machinery of the monarchy behind him. Beatrice and Eugenie got none of that. What they got was a title that opened doors, and a surname that, increasingly, shut them. The concept that shaped their future had a name before it had consequences. For years, reporting on King Charles, first as Prince of Wales, then as monarch, referenced his preference for a slimmed-down monarchy. The Spectator put it bluntly. For years now, we've been hearing about King Charles's plans for a slimmed-down monarchy. IB Times was more specific. Beatrice and Eugenie have been kept firmly outside King Charles's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy. AOL reported that both sisters spent recent years attempting to carve out independent careers after King Charles made clear they wouldn't be full-time working royals. No formal palace document was ever published saying the York princesses would have no future operational role. That's not how the monarchy communicates. The message came through structures, not statements. By one common count, there are 11 working royals in the British system: Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, and Sophie, and 4 elderly extended family members: the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, the Duke of Kent, and Princess Alexandra. Not one of those positions belonged to Beatrice or Eugenie. More than a decade ago, both sisters lost their taxpayer-funded police protection. They were told plainly that they weren't working royals. This wasn't framed as punishment. At the time, it was presented as pragmatism, a recognition that the monarchy couldn't expand the official payroll for every titled grandchild, but it also drew a line. You are family. You aren't staff. The distinction would matter enormously later. Prince Andrew didn't accept it quietly. Multiple reports over the years described him lobbying for his daughters to be given larger roles within the institution. In 2016, the tension became public enough that Andrew felt compelled to deny it. The Independent ran the headline, "Prince Andrew denies rift with Prince Charles over future roles of daughters Eugenie and Beatrice." Andrew's statement called continued speculation pointless. The denial fueled reports of a dispute and showed how public the question had become. The reasons Andrew lost were partly financial, partly strategic, and partly reputational. The York branch of the family had been a long-running headache for the palace well before the name Epstein entered the conversation. Andrew himself had accumulated years of negative press coverage under labels that stuck. ITV called him Air Miles Andy, the Falklands hero, Playboy Prince, and controversial royal. The Irish Examiner documented concerns about his connections with controversial foreign figures during his decade as Britain's special representative for international trade and investment. ITV's summary was blunt. His 10-year stint in the role generated a great deal of controversy. The trade envoy position was terminated in July 2011. Sarah Ferguson, the sister's mother, carried her own freight. Town & Country published an entire retrospective under the headline, "A History of Sarah Ferguson's Scandals." By the time Beatrice and Eugenie were building their adult lives, the York family brand was already dented. A mix of entitlement stories, spending controversies, and social misjudgments that made the palace nervous about anything that put the York name in a prominent position. Commentary around the Yorks often circled back to privilege, embarrassment, and overspending. Exactly the kind of image a modernizing monarchy was trying to shed. Beatrice and Eugenie weren't responsible for any of this. They didn't choose their parents, didn't control the tabloid cycle, didn't make the financial decisions that generated headlines. But they were attached to the York name, and the York name was a problem the palace had been managing, not promoting, for a very long time. There were moments when the trajectory seemed like it might bend. Tatler, in a piece from mid-2025, asked whether Beatrice and Eugenie could become the new stars of the royal family, describing them as increasingly invaluable to the modern monarchy. William invited both sisters to Buckingham Palace garden parties in consecutive years. Eugenie attended one hosted by William and Catherine in 2024, mingling with guests on the lawn and looking, as Tatler noted, every inch the modern princess. Eugenie had carved out meaningful charity work. She was associated with anti-slavery campaigning and served as patron of Anti-Slavery International for 7 years. Beatrice, for her part, had her own charity interests. In late 2025, she was appointed deputy patron of the Outward Bound Trust, alongside the Duke of Edinburgh, a position her father had once held. That appointment was read by some coverage as a sign that the king had no plans to sever the York sisters from public-facing roles entirely. For a few months in mid-2025, it almost looked like Beatrice and Eugenie might find a lane. The monarchy was short-staffed after a bruising 2024, and the case for bringing the sisters off the bench seemed stronger than it had in years. But the case was also built on quicksand, because the thing that kept pulling the York sisters back toward the margins was the same thing that had been pulling them there since childhood: their father. On November 14, 2019, Emily Maitlis sat across from Prince Andrew in Buckingham Palace and conducted what CNN called a PR nightmare and a national joke, and The Guardian described as the anatomy of a PR disaster. The Newsnight interview had been secured after 6 months of negotiations, with Andrew's team referring the decision up what The Guardian called the royal chain of command before agreeing. Andrew arrived at Buckingham Palace confident enough that, after the interview, he reportedly gave Maitlis and the Newsnight crew a tour of the building. Beatrice was part of the lead-up. BBC producer Sam McAllister, who negotiated the interview, wrote in her book, Scoops, that Andrew brought his eldest daughter to a pre-interview meeting. "To be frank," McAllister wrote, "the only thing worse than speaking to a prospective interviewee about allegations of sexual impropriety is having to do so in front of his daughter." McAllister described Beatrice as polite and engaged, carrying a notebook and pen. She called Beatrice the rainmaker, the person who, in her view, had her father's interests purely at heart and helped create the relaxed atmosphere that gave Andrew the confidence to proceed. The interview aired on November 16, 2019, and the fallout was immediate. Andrew claimed he couldn't have danced with Virginia Giuffre at a London nightclub because he'd temporarily lost the ability to sweat after an adrenaline overdose during the Falklands War. He said he'd been at a Pizza Express in Woking with Beatrice on the night of the alleged encounter. He described staying in Epstein's Manhattan mansion for 3 days after Epstein's conviction for sex offenses against a minor as a convenient place to stay. The Guardian wrote that the interview revealed a grotesque mismatch between the Duke of York's language and demeanor, and the gravity of the allegations which continue to surround him. 4 days later, on November 20, 2019, Andrew announced he was stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. The BBC, the New York Times, NPR, and CNN all reported the withdrawal. KPMG pulled its sponsorship of his entrepreneurial initiative, Pitch at Palace. Standard Chartered withdrew its support. Within months, he'd relinquished all 230 of his patronages. The Newsnight interview didn't create the institutional verdict on the York branch, but it converted years of quiet marginalization into open crisis, and the damage radiated outward, exactly as the palace had always feared it would. On January 13, 2022, Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew's military affiliations and royal patronages had been returned to the Queen. The BBC reported the decision plainly. The Guardian framed it as the Queen seeking to distance the monarchy from the Duke of York. NPR noted that Andrew had continued to hold honorary military titles in Britain until that point. He would, the palace said, defend this case as a private citizen. The word private did the heavy lifting. The institution was formally separating itself from the man. Beatrice and Eugenie's titles survived that round. People magazine reported that their titles and position were wholly unaffected by the seismic decision. The BBC confirmed that their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, would continue to have the title of princess as scandal surrounds their parents. The monarchy drew a line between Andrew's punishment and the sisters' formal status. But formal status and real inclusion are different currencies. The next 3 years followed a pattern that became almost predictable, a moment of proximity followed by a firmer boundary. The sisters attended garden parties, Trooping the Color, Royal Ascot, Christmas at Sandringham. They supported their uncle's charity initiatives. They showed up. But showing up wasn't the same as belonging, and the institution made sure the distinction was always visible. Marie Claire reported in 2024 that Beatrice becoming a working royal was out of the question. The reasoning, according to royal correspondent Rebecca English, traced back to Harry and Meghan's departure. When the Sussexes left in January 2020, they'd proposed a half-in, half-out arrangement, part-time royals with commercial careers on the side. Queen Elizabeth turned them down flat. English wrote that the Queen was told the preferred option was simply unacceptable, that seeking commercial deals while acting on behalf of the British head of state would also have been a clear conflict of interest. The precedent was set, full-time or nothing. English's conclusion was stark. More substantial roles for William's cousins are out of the question, for now, at least. That precedent trapped Beatrice and Eugenie in a double bind. They couldn't become working royals because they had private careers. They had private careers because they'd been told they wouldn't become working royals. The circle was closed before Andrew's scandal made it permanent. In October 2025, the institution moved with a decisiveness that hadn't been seen in the modern monarchy. A House of Commons library briefing recorded that the king had initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. Later reporting said Andrew would cease using the Duke of York title and honors and would be known, going forward, simply as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Andrew was also forced out of Royal Lodge in Windsor. 16 days later, on February 19, 2026, his 66th birthday, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office in connection with his ties to Epstein. He was the first senior British royal arrested since Charles I, nearly 400 years earlier. The shockwave hit Beatrice and Eugenie immediately. ABC reported that the sisters, who are 9th and 12th in line to the British throne, had publicly stayed silent and carried on their lives, occasionally appearing at royal events in an unofficial capacity. The consequences materialized fast. Multiple outlets, The Spectator, InStyle, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, reported that the sisters had been told they couldn't join the royal family at Royal Ascot in June 2026. The Spectator's Flora Watkins framed it as the visible collapse of the slimmed-down monarchy's math. At a stroke, with the most recent dump of the Epstein files, Beatrice and Eugenie have been excised from the equation. As recently as last summer, they were being touted as taking on bigger roles within the firm. Eugenie's charity work came under direct pressure. The Observer confirmed that her role at Anti-Slavery International had ended after 7 years. The charity issued a careful statement. After 7 years, our patronage from HRH Princess Eugenie of York has come to an end. We thank the princess very much for her support. Her profile was removed from the organization's website. A stream of royal commentators argued that, while the sisters still held their titles, the York brand had become increasingly toxic. That is as close to a definition of modern royal exile as you'll find. They remain princesses. They remain HRHs. They remain 9th and 12th in the line of succession. But they aren't part of the monarchy's working core. What they don't have is a function. They may still appear, but they don't sit inside the institution's operational center. The label remains, the role does not. Even then, some late-year coverage tried to find a hopeful note. It suggested that King Charles remained fond of his nieces, and that new roles might still be possible. But those optimistic briefings arrived in the same media cycle as the Ascot reports and the patronage loss. The pattern suggests that the monarchy had been moving in this direction for a very long time. When Beatrice and Eugenie lost their police protection over a decade ago, that was a signal. When Andrew was publicly denying reports of a rift over their future roles, that was a signal. When Charles built his slimmed-down model around a small working core and left no chair for either sister, that was a signal. When the Queen refused Harry and Meghan's half-in, half-out proposal and thereby shut off the only obvious framework that might have accommodated part-time princesses, that mattered too. Andrew's arrest didn't invent the exile. The Newsnight interview didn't invent it. The Epstein files didn't invent it. Those events accelerated a position the institution already seemed to hold and had been communicating in the language of guest lists and carefully anonymous briefings for years. The palace didn't suddenly discover that the York branch was a liability. The pattern suggests it had long treated the sisters as peripheral. The only question was how long the fiction of inclusion could be maintained, and what would finally make maintaining it more costly than dropping it. Beatrice and Eugenie were born into a category that looked like privilege and functioned like a countdown. Princess by birth, optional by design, expendable by precedent. The monarchy never promised them a future inside the institution. It just never told them, in words anyone could quote, that they didn't have one. That's the cruelty of the whole thing, not the sudden fall. The years of being allowed to stand close enough to believe they belonged. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe for more like it.